It's trade deadline week in the NHL. What does that mean for the Edmonton Oilers? A whole lot to get to on today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On today's show, an overview of trade deadline week. We're going to start with the Evander Kane situation, how the Oilers might go about resolving that, what the options are. Second segment, we're going to talk about what the Oilers could be targeting, and then we'll wrap talking about what I think is going to end up happening over the course of the week. So at the start, coming into this year, there was an assumption that Evander Kane was going to play. He did not have corrective surgery once the regular season ended. He opted to go the physical therapy and rehabilitation route as opposed to corrective surgery. And he didn't pass the physical at the start of the season. He got the injury, which was an abdominal injury that hampered him during the playoffs last year. The last game he played was game 2 of the Stanley Cup final against the Florida Panthers. But after that, the injury was too much to play through, and the Oilers opted to pull him from the lineup. And when you have a player who has a serious injury that keeps him from games, and you have an offseason, there is an implied assumption that team and player are going to come to the best possible agreement as to the course of action, the corrective action, what it's going to take to get this player ready to go to start the next season on time. And instead, Kane opted for the physical therapy and rehabilitation route and couldn't pass a physical and had to get surgery anyway. And then about a month or so ago, he had to get an additional procedure done on his knee. It wasn't reconstructive or anything of that nature. There was something that needed to be removed. And now we're here. It is the first week of March. The NHL trade deadline is Friday afternoon. It is unclear as to whether or not Evander Kane will physically be able to play in the NHL before the start of the playoffs. And this brings us to the first of several inflection points in this Evander Kane conversation that lead out all the permutations. So number one, Elliotte Friedman reported today that there may be a bit of a disagreement between the team and Evander Kane. Evander Kane, as a player, wants to get back out there. He wants to play as soon as he is physically able because he wants to prove that he is still an effective player. And B, he wants to be able to play so that by the time the playoffs start, he's not trying to get his feet under him. It's going to be an extremely tall order for Evander Kane's first game back to be the first game of the playoffs and expect him to play well. You think about how long a layoff hits a team, and then you talk about that in terms of one guy who hasn't played since June of last year, and you're telling him the first game he's going to play is in a playoff environment, which is tight checking, which is fast, we're against a quality opponent, and that feels a bit unrealistic. I've been hammering that point for a while now on Locked On Oilers that if Kane should return, they're going to be in a tough situation, both cap-wise and lineup-wise, and now you're reaching that inflection point, because if he wants to play sooner rather than later, he can make this a problem for the Oilers. If he feels like the Oilers are holding him out of the lineup, not for injury reasons, but for roster management reasons, he can go to the NHL Players Association. He can file a grievance and say, the Oilers aren't playing me. I'm healthy enough to play. I want to play. And the Oilers will, of course, say, well, it's a lineup decision. We don't think he's one of our best 18 skaters for this given night, and you'll end up with that mess. But the other part of this, and why this is relevant now especially, is on Saturday, Evander Kane's no trade protection changed. It went from a full no movement clause to a yes 16 team list. What does that mean? I'm glad you asked. So on Saturday, Evander Kane and his representation had to submit a list of teams to the Oilers that he would accept the trade to. 16 teams. From what Elliotte Friedman reported, he is okay with being traded to a playoff team. Evander Kane wants the chance to go to a contender and wants to play. Now, there are several roadblocks and impediments to said move being facilitated. Number one, Evander Kane is on LTIR right now. So if the Oilers were to trade him, they would need to activate him off of LTIR. They would then need to trade him to another team. The problem there, and Elliot Friedman explained this, if the Oilers were to trade him to another team, that team would need to have the cap space requisite to acquiring Evander Kane before they could then put him on LTIR themselves. It's a paper transaction in that sense, but that is the way the rule is structured. Could the Oilers retain salary to facilitate a trade? Yes, I would frankly encourage the Oilers to retain salary on an Evander Kane trade if that meant getting some of his money back so that they could improve the roster ahead of the trade deadline. Yes, you only have 3 of those salary retention slots, but to facilitate getting some of that money back, it would help. But again, that doesn't totally help the Oilers here. Where you can only retain up to 50% of a player's contract. I suppose you could have a third team take another half, a quarter of Evander Kane's contract to get that number down even smaller. But that's not an inconsequential number. The Oilers need as much cap space as they can get if they want to improve this roster, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But there are multiple layers to why this is going to be challenging. There is an understanding that the Oilers are listening, that they would like to try and move Evander Kane, that they are searching the market to look for and acquire a deal and make a move to send Evander Kane somewhere else. The problem, on top of the money, team's probably going to want a sweetener to take him, whether that's a prospect, a draft pick. They're probably going to want something in addition to Evander Kane, because as we said at the start, he hasn't played since June of last year. There's no guarantee that he's going to be effective once he gets back in the lineup. And even if he is, it's probably going to take a week or so for him to get up to game speed to be even moderately effective. The one more year of team control, he'll be under contract for next year as well. And that's a different conversation. I think in an ideal world, if you didn't need this cap space so pressingly, you would probably make this decision in the summer. It's a lot easier to make trades with term and money in the summer because more teams have some flexibility. There's more liquidity in the market. Teams have more cap space to play with. They have more assets to play with, and it makes managing your finances a little bit easier. It's why we typically see the big trades happen around the draft, because that's when teams are at their maximum liquidity, where free agents aren't under contract, where guys who are about to become unrestricted or restricted free agents, their contract status is about to change, and it's the easiest to make that move. This is a real monkey wrench in the situation for the Oilers. There are a lot of needs on this team. You could make an argument they need another goalie, a top 4 defenseman, a top 9 winger, a 4th line center. You can make an argument they need as many as 4 players, and having $5.5–6 million tied up in a player who's insisting he's healthy enough to play, even though you may not think so yourself, you may think he's being a little bit self-centered, that he's looking out for him more than the team. And that's his prerogative. You as an Oiler fan are allowed to be frustrated that a player isn't seeing the bigger picture. It is my job as the host of Locked On Oilers to remind you, Evander Kane doesn't owe the Oilers anything. If he wants to play and he's healthy enough to play, he's going to insist he plays. And that has positive connotations when a guy wants to gut it out through injury and play in important games because they want to help their team win. That has negative connotations when you're trying to manage your team's finances and put yourself in a position to improve the roster so that when the playoffs do come around, you can activate that player off of LTIR. Very famous examples, Nikita Kucherov, Mark Stone, Patrick Kane. Teams can do this and have had great success in using LTIR money on players in the regular season, then coming back in the playoffs, adding the player who was on LTIR to begin with, and having an even deeper lineup. So the Oilers have to get clarity on what they're going to do with Evander Kane before we can really talk about improving this team, because there's no doubt about it. Anytime you are a team that is in playoff contention, you want to try and improve your roster. You want to try and improve your odds, whether that's 1%, 2%, 3%. You want to do everything you can as a general manager to improve your team's chances. We are going to take our first break of today's show. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about what the Oilers shopping list might look like, some candidates, and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachio is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help you feeling fuller longer. Personally, I love the no-shell variety. They're the perfect grab-and-go snack for busy days. Whether I'm snacking at my desk, on a road trip, or just need a quick protein boost, they're a great go-to. Or if you're old school and you like cracking open the shell, for that satisfying crunch, the in-shell options are a classic favorite. Wonderful Pistachios are a complete protein providing all 9 essential amino acids. Whether you're running meetings or dropping off the kids, Wonderful Pistachios are the snack that works as hard as you do. Get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out here on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers as we're walking through trade deadline week in the NHL, and where we've had a few moves happen already. You know, Mikko Rantanen to Carolina happened a few weeks ago. Ryan Lindgren got traded to the Avalanche. And this isn't like years past. There's no huge big name player. There's no Jake Gensel. There's no Erik Karlsson. There's no Mark Stone. There's no huge move to be had. There are nice pieces out there. You look around, somebody like a Brock Nelson, somebody like a Brandon Carlo. There are useful, functional NHL players out there available for sale. Someone like a Riley Smith of the New York Rangers, Jonathan Quick. There are interesting pieces out there in a variety of situations that could be helpful if you're a Stanley Cup contender. There are some teams I know, like the Winnipeg Jets and the Washington Capitals, who are being a bit more reserved and tactile in their decisions because they believe the chemistry they've fostered through the first 60 or so regular season games might be more important than the marginal improvement of adding 1 or 2 pieces. And it's one of the great debates within the realm of professional sports. Do you want to go out and add the biggest and best name, or do you want to try and find a specialized skill set? And there are drawbacks and pros to both sides of it. And I personally have started to ebb and lean towards the direction that you want to get targeted specialized roles. And it's not that you don't want to improve your team. You know, of course, if you could add a great player to your team, you want to do that. But the conundrum, the challenge, if you will, when you have to go out and add a big piece like a Jake Gensel or a Mikko Rantanen. And look, Rantanen's a little bit different. That was we couldn't agree to a long-term extension with a superstar. We wanted to reclaim some value, get a little bit younger, a little bit more team control. I get it. But when you have to go out and add a big piece, that typically means the foundation of your team as it existed needed something more. And that likely tells me that your core, your best players, aren't as up to snuff, because the best teams have their superstar players in place. You know, when Colorado went out and added Arturi Lehkonen and Josh Manson, they already had Landeskog and McKinnon and Makar and Rantanen. When Vegas went out and added Ivan Barbashev and Jonathan Quick, they already had Eichel and Stone and Pietrangelo. Those Tampa Bay teams, when they went back-to-back, they already had Kucherov and Stamkos and Point and Hedman and McDonough and Vasilevsky. So they went and got Blake Coleman and Barclay Goodrow. And this is a real recurring theme in today's landscape. It's hard to adjust a player who has a huge role in season. I've talked about this a lot over the last few weeks on Locked On Oilers, the idea that you don't want to go out and add a starting goalie, because it's hard to get that starting goalie up to speed in 20 games. If you add a third goalie to this mix, and you're going to assume Calvin Pickard would be the odd man out, and we'll start with the Oilers shopping list for the week at that goaltender position, which it feels like is the burgeoning consensus, at least amongst the side of Oilers fans I see on social media, whether it's in the YouTube comments, whether it's on Twitter. There's a real burgeoning consensus now that failure to add a third goalie to this mix would be just nothing short of a catastrophe. There's a real feeling that Stuart Skinner and Calvin Pickard's struggles this year are or at least would be a particularly large impediment to any potential playoff success in a way that wasn't the case last year. And I wouldn't say I went into last year's playoffs expecting a lot from Stuart Skinner. He was fine for the most part. He did get benched for a portion of the Canucks series, but he bounced back nicely after that. I think the Oilers' offense not scoring as well as it has in years past is really a big it's the big difference. In years past, the Oilers' defensive woes, their goaltending woes, you've always had a little bit of underlying confidence that their offense would be able to make up for it, to balance it out. And that's always been the drawback. Can you outscore your problems? And generally speaking in hockey, the answer is no. It's really hard in the playoffs to outscore defensive and goaltending issues because defense ultimately is going to have a strong impact, and it's really going to dictate your goaltending at large. Unless you have that Andrei Vasilevsky or Sergei Bobrovsky type, if you don't have one of those guys, your environmental factors are really going to dictate how a goalie performs. And with that in mind, you think about the projects and the ideas the Oilers have undertaken this year. They spent a lot of money on day one of free agency and Victor Arvidsson and Jeff Skinner. They figured those guys would slide in nicely as Dylan Holloway and Ryan McLeod replacements or Warren Fogle, depending which guy you want to put in what spot. And it just hasn't gelled. Arvidsson hasn't really been healthy. He hasn't had that goal scoring touch. He hasn't really naturally fit with Leon Draisaitl, which is where he was expected to play. Jeff Skinner's got fine underlying numbers. I don't really have an issue with what Jeff Skinner's done and the role he's been given, but he really hasn't clicked that well either. I know there's a little bit of conjecture out there. There's been a little bit of reporting that the Oilers have gauged what it would look like to try and trade Victor Arvidsson, but he does have some no trade protection, even though that's not been reported previously. That was reported over the weekend. So the Oilers are in a position where they likely need to add a third goalie, a defenseman, and a top nine forward. I think of those three, the most likely that they will actually go out and get is probably another defenseman, because it's pretty easy to go out there and get a third pair defenseman for like a third or a fourth round pick. And I think largely, and through no fault of his own, because a lot of the roster decisions were made before Stan Bowman took the reins. And I think Stan Bowman, the moves he did end up making, going out and getting Vasily Podkolzin, getting Ty Emberson in return for Cody Ceci, I think those were largely the best he could do with the hand he was dealt. And I think the Oilers have a real question mark here. Do they think they are simply underperforming what they can do? Or are they kind of a different team now? And I'll wrap this segment with this thought. Typically speaking, when I look at teams in the playoffs, my question is always, how high can their ceiling get? And this year's Oilers, even when they were on a nice stretch of games, from late November through early January, had one of the best records in the entire league, decent goaltending, strong special teams, really good 5-on-5 numbers. It still never looked great. It still never felt great. And that anecdotal evidence isn't always the best measure of efficiency, or frankly, it's not necessarily always accurate. You can feel a certain way. That doesn't necessarily make it true or the case. But now, after the losing streak, and they bounced back nicely, it was good that they beat Carolina, who is a good team. The Hurricanes are a playoff team. They're going to have a good chance finishing second in the Metro behind the Capitals, who very well could push the Jets for the President's Trophy. But the Oilers have real question marks. And if Stan Bowman doesn't feel like the core of the group is good enough, then it's not his prerogative to go out and add crazy. If you don't think this team is capable of beating Minnesota or Winnipeg or Vegas or even Vancouver or Dallas, why would you go out there and burn a first round pick or a prospect on like a Ryan O'Reilly? That as good as I think Ryan O'Reilly is, even now, I don't think he's the difference between them being able to upset a Vegas or a Dallas or a Minnesota or Winnipeg. We're going to take one more break on today's show. We come back. I'm going to tackle what I think is going to happen over the course of the week with the Oilers, what I think might happen a little bit more on the macro side of things in the Western Conference ahead of the trade deadline. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where you've got your team covered every day. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out here on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are setting the tone for trade deadline week. This is a great time of year. I love this time of year, both because it's exciting just purely from a spectator perspective, but as somebody who loves to understand things, who loves to overthink things, to lay things out, to try and get as deep an understanding as possible, trade deadline week is one of the rare opportunities where I get an inside purview on what a general manager thinks about their team. And I said this last week in regards to Stan Bowman rebuffing the idea they needed another goalie, that they don't think there's a goalie out there that's a big improvement on their current situation, so they weren't really inclined to do it. General managers, coaches, owners, stakeholders, people who have power and authority, there's no benefit to them being transparent. If anything, it benefits them more to be obtuse, to be opaque, to not give anything away. If you're Stan Bowman, you don't want to let other GMs know what you need, because that's going to hurt you when it comes to negotiating. If anything, you have a material interest in giving misinformation out and telling Frank Saravelli, nah, we don't want a goalie. No, why would you come out and say you want a goalie? That could only hurt you. If you want to go get Karel Vejmelka or Jonathan Quick or John Gibson, those teams know that. If you go out and say on the record that you want that, that's only going to make those guys more emboldened to ask for more. And some general managers have better reputations for being sticklers about value and trying to be as annoying as possible to getting as much as they possibly can in return. Some GMs have a bit more of a track record of pragmatism, of trying to find a deal that works reasonably well for both sides without getting one over on the other guy. And I, for one, don't have a strong feel yet because I don't know about Evander Kane. If the Oilers can trade Evander Kane, they're going to have an opportunity to dramatically improve the roster by Friday, 4:00 Eastern. They desperately need a little bit of help. They don't need a ton. They need a little bit more help. And some of that is through no fault of their own. The role Jeff Skinner's had, Victor Arvidsson, Nuge, Adam Henry, Connor Brown, they've gotten okay production out of Zach Hyman, out of McDavid. They've gotten great production out of Leon. Leon should probably win the Hart. I would be a bit disappointed if he didn't, so at least so far. Those guys need help. And the Oilers seem very resolved to keep that third line of Henrique, Janmark, and Connor Brown together based on their playoff success last year, based on their penalty killing success. It feels like McDavid is going to stay playing with Nuge and Zach Hyman, and then the conversation becomes, well, we love the way Podkolzin plays with Draisaitl. They have the puck a ton. They create very well for each other, but Podkolzin's not a good enough finisher to play on a second line. You need somebody who has a genuine goal scoring touch to play in that spot. And if Jeff Skinner's defense is a prerequisite for getting there, he's never going to get there. Jeff Skinner's never been a great defensive forward, but you would think, based on how he's played and the underlying numbers in his minutes, you would think that was enough. You would think that Jeff Skinner had done enough to stay in the lineup consistently and earned a reasonable chance to at least audition for a spot with Leon. And I think that's what frustrates me the most as far as understanding what the Oilers need. I can authoritatively tell you John Klingberg is not ready to be a second pair NHL defenseman right now on a good team. Could he be better? Yeah. Could he get better with more work? Of course. But in the minutes John Klingberg has played, the Oilers have been underwater. They have not had the puck a lot. They have been on the ice for a lot of goals against, a lot of quality scoring chances against. And because of that, they are in a position where they need a top four defenseman. there aren't really any slam dunk obvious top 4 defensemen out there that fit what the Oilers can do money-wise and also assets-wise, which is another part of this as well. The Oilers don't have a robust coffer of prospects. They don't have a first-round pick this year. They need to figure out what it's going to take to bridge the gap to the team they currently are to the team that they could potentially be. And we got to talk about ceiling, and we got to talk about floor. The Oilers are a playoff team. The Oilers entered this year as the betting favorite to win the Stanley Cup. They had all type of hype based on the offseason they had. They added 2 top 6 forwards. They overhauled the defense. They got cheaper on the back end. They got younger on the back end. You figured adding Jeff Skinner and Victor Arvidsson to replace Warren Foegele and Ryan McLeod would do wonders for your group. And it hasn't happened. Fundamentally, it has materially not happened for this group. The Oilers are going to have 20 some odd, 30 some odd less goals than they scored as a team last year. Some of that is power play regression. Some of that is career year regression. Zach Hyman's going to finish in the ballpark of 20 something goals as opposed to 50 something. You're going to have drop offs from Arvidsson to Foegele, a drop off from McLeod to Skinner. And the bottom 6 has not materialized in the way that it probably should have. The results that Henrique, Connor Brown, and Janmark have at 5-on-5, they're not awful. They're reasonably close to even in terms of expected goals, and they're over even in high danger chances, but the finishing hasn't been there. They're under 8% at 5-on-5. They've gotten subpar goaltending in those minutes as well. 895, in their minutes 5-on-5 this year. And it just feels like this group is missing something. Last year's team had a little bit more juice to it, and they look slow. Last week against Florida, this Oilers team looked really, really slow and really, really struggled to win puck battles, to get to loose pucks. And in the playoffs, foot speed is probably the single most important trait. I know there are some people who are going to say toughness, who are going to say size. You got to get there before those matter. And right now, sitting here, and we'll end on this note, it feels like the Oilers' biggest need is defense. I think you need to get another defenseman in this mix that can really push Klingberg, Stetcher, or Emberson either out of the lineup or push them to play better with the prospect of being pushed out of the lineup. I think there's a strong argument. You want another forward to add to this mix to push Janmark or Connor Brown down a spot on the forward lines to the 4th line, pushes somebody from that 4th line to being the 13th forward. And I still think your single biggest need going into Friday is a goalie that can be a 1B to Stuart Skinner should he falter down the backstretch or in the regular season, because you don't want Calvin Pickard having prolonged a stretch of starts. That's just not going to be conducive to winning in the NHL at this point. Pickard is a fine backup where if he plays every 3rd, 4th game or second half of back-to-backs, he's not going to kill you. But when we're talking about playoff series against good teams, you can't be going in there with somebody who's under 900 save percentage on the year. And I know Stuart Skinner is that as well, but that has a different tenor. Skinner has at least been a good goalie in the playoffs at various points. Calvin Pickard is just not an NHL starter. He isn't. He hasn't been one in a long time. And that's okay. That's not disqualifying from being a backup on a good team, but it definitely gives you pause if you're an Oilers fan going into the playoffs. That'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast. Check us out over on YouTube if you're more inclined to watch a show. Thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. Now go check out Locked On NHL as your second listen with all of the experts from Locked On's NHL Network with the local analysis you love. Check it out wherever you get your podcasts. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.